Welcome back. This is the Dawning Podcast's Alt History series, part 4 of 5. If you haven't already, please check out parts 1 through 3. Today's episode is called Putting It Into Practice. I am petty. So how do the theories in alt history fit the evidence better than modern academic thought? Hello. They don't. Like my professor said about astrology in part 3, theories of alt history always have another layer of conspiracy when met with resistance in the form of logic. Take this pseudo-archaeology YouTuber's comment section interaction. The commenter says, quote, "Watched a few of your videos now. I've noticed you're very dismissive of modern science and history. You even called people who don't agree with your stance a skeptard. Yet all you do is speculate and expect your audience to dismiss the work of thousands of professionals who would love nothing more than to discover a new history of the world. I have to say you lost me when you implied governments or the church pull funding to prevent the truth from being exposed. If this was remotely true, people would have spoken out about it en masse. Do you have any examples of this happening, or what they were quote-unquote covering up? The way you talk about it, you must have many examples. Historians and scientists have their work checked, and are checked again by their peers from all over the world. So for their work to be published, it has to be of a very high quality. Plus, it's not like these people don't want to find amazing things. The problem is you need proof, not just broad speculation like, oh, we have been here 300,000 years. Surely we must have done something. Maybe we did, but you have to prove it. Dismissing what you don't understand or agree with, then calling professionals or people who trust them skeptards is kinda low. I'm open to something more happening, but you have to prove it. Also, your tour guide in this video seems to have you guys well pegged and is playing into the conspiracy aspects of the area as he knows you'll lap it up. It's his job to make sure you have fun, so..." And here they put a shrug emoji. The YouTuber responds, quote, "Our tour guide is the son of one of the late ancient wisdom keepers of Kemet, the indigenous people of Egypt pre-dynasty. He was telling us both the modern Egyptologist views and the ancient perspective as what was taught to him. It was up to us to think about it. Interesting that the ancient Cometian timeline accounts for a lot of the holes, mysteries, and question marks in the modern day view. And yes, lots and lots of examples of times when either government or church defunded. I think they're trying to say Gunung Padang. Gunung Padang was getting excavated and was stood down by the authorities once the carbon dating was hitting 20,000 years old. Same thing happened to a dig in South America. Funding is so hard to come by. If anyone even hints at something non-mainstream, you get labeled a quack and lose your income. I was in Egypt where the government are ripping out the crystal that lines the pyramids and burying it out in the desert. Have literal video evidence of before and after. Also, a lot of my argument comes from science and geology. The mainstream timeline has serious holes and problems that can't be accounted for. Geology is telling a different story to the original narrative, and science is backing up more and more of the idea we are from a history of cycles." The commenter responds to the YouTuber's response, quote, "Yes, but you pick and choose what suits you. You ignore everything else. Carbon dating is flawed unless it suits the conspiracies. You still haven't addressed the fact that you clearly have no respect for the scientists unless it suits your narrative. You make bold claims of what you think items are or how they were made without presenting an example. There are many videos explaining how they made the pyramids and why the dates are what they are stated as. I can link you to an archaeologist who has fantastic videos explaining it. What you're really doing is selling a narrative with very loose quote-unquote evidence, and then selling it as more real than actual historical work done by modern scientists. You can't just post crap and get away with it. That's not how science works. I've noticed with you and another YouTuber, you point to holes, sell a narrative, but never back it up with real evidence. Or if you do, you ignore big parts of the story so it fits in whatever your video is about. It's sad because you're clearly intelligent. If you're this passionate, get qualified and find the irrefutable evidence. Unfortunately, there just isn't any. Not yet, anyway. What you're doing is making people doubt science. Of course they should try to use their own mind, but unfortunately it's leading to a lot of uneducated people becoming ultra-paranoid and doubting everything. The YouTuber did not respond after this, but let's dissect this entire argument. The commenter made 6 separate points, in my opinion. Number 1, the use of the term skeptard. Number 2, that the YouTuber was dismissive of peer-reviewed findings / academia. Number 3, that the commenter wanted evidence of government and the church defunding fieldwork that proved or lent itself to advanced ancient technology hypotheses. Number 4, that people would speak out against such a defunding in droves. Number 5, that the YouTuber has no evidence of any of their own claims about advanced ancient technology. And finally, number 6, that the YouTuber's tour guide was telling them what they wanted to hear. So number 1, the YouTuber's response does not even address half the points the commenter makes. Therefore, there's no defense nor any acknowledgement of the phrase skeptard. I found the YouTuber in question using this in another of their videos, and I too found it in really poor taste. But this is a personal gripe, unattached to the subject. Let's move on, but with disdain. Number 2, the YouTuber's response also fails to acknowledge their dismissal of peer-reviewed research and academics. The YouTuber never links specific studies for or against their claims, and while the commenter doesn't either, the burden of proof lies with the person proposing the theory that goes against the mainstream. Additionally, I found that in this subculture, there's a very aggressive attitude toward professional historians and archaeologists, and I don't quite understand where it comes from. I can understand on a human level why these people get so defensive about their own theories getting rejected with each new discovery, but they actively believe and spread the idea that professionals are trying to keep some hidden truth from the world, as if these academics wouldn't benefit greatly from having discovered something so contradictory. The alt history people are actually exhibiting the very traits, like defensiveness, hostility, closed-mindedness, that they're painting the quote-unquote establishment academics with, and I guess the irony is lost on them. Outside of that, I find the rejection and distrust of experts a very dangerous trend that I think we should all try to stamp out with patience and politeness, at least at first. Smash the stupidity if you have to. Number 3, the YouTuber addresses the government and church defunding point, at least to the best of their apparently limited ability. They say, Gunung Padang was getting excavated and was stood down by the authorities once the carbon dating was hitting 20,000 years old. This was pretty fun to debunk. First of all, I think they're referring to what Wikipedia is calling Gunung Padang, a megalithic site in Indonesia. This point is actually quite a big deal and could be an entire episode in itself. In short, the YouTuber is of course using misleading information which took me all of 4 seconds to Google. I did have to take a breather after. The first article I found in, response to this was a general public piece, which is always a good place to start when you're getting your bearings with a topic. I think I found it in the references on the Wikipedia page for Gunung Padang, which admittedly says it needs more references and checks, but the article works for our purposes. I know because I read it. It's called Digging for the Truth at Controversial Megalithic Site from July 2013. Yeah, a short article explaining the issues of the dating for Gunung Padang is almost 9 years old and a Google away. So regarding the dating of Gunung Padang, the article says, quote, "These views are loudly disputed. A petition signed in April by 34 Indonesian archaeologists and geologists and submitted to Yudhoyono, the country's president at the time, agrees that the upper part of Gunung Padang is, quote, the largest megalithic structure in Southeast Asia, unquote, but the experts are deeply suspicious of the Arif team's methods and motives, and the geological flag-waving it is trying to invoke," end quote. The next portion talks a little bit more about that flag-waving and the nationalistic aspect of Arif's research. Quote, "The petitioners do not like Arif's plans to involve common people as volunteers to support the Red and White Glory operation in Gunung Padang, which they call research. Red and white are the colors of the Indonesian flag. This activity is carried out without scientific norms of conservation knowledge," the petitioners say. They believe the excavation threatens the preservation of the existing site, and hint strongly that archaeologists, as opposed to geologists, should be involved. One of them, volcanologist Sutikno Bronto, says Gunung Padang is simply the neck of a nearby volcano, not an ancient pyramid. End quote. Basically, the team doing the research that the YouTuber cited has been challenged by archaeologists for their unscientific methodology. And this is just the Sunday Morning Herald. Let me show you what the scholarly article said about it. Get comfy. The scholarly article was found on Google Scholar with no paywall at the time of my own research. I'll, of course, link all of these for your perusal. This one's called Indonesia's Own Pyramid, The Imagined Past and Nationalism of Gunung Padang, from January 2021. The pages of interest to me are 6, 7, 9, and 10. Here are some excerpts. Page 6. TTRM's chief geologist, Danny Hillman, and lead archaeologist, Ali Akbar, made multiple claims that Gunung Padang's pyramid is much older than the pyramids at Giza, and that the site is at least 10 times larger than Borobudur. Page 3 continued. TTRM's research at Gunung Padang was strongly opposed by archaeologists from multiple sectors, including the academia and some state institutions. The criticisms were leveled mainly on methodological grounds, citing TTRM's approach as lacking in standard archaeological methods. This includes 1. TTRM's lack of documentation when removing columnar joints from its archaeological context, 2. Lack of attention paid to stratigraphy, 3. Site destruction, and 4. TTRM's obscene budget compared to a lack of funding at other state institutions. TTRM's attempt to recruit 500 volunteers to participate in a mass excavation in 2013 called, conspicuously, Operation to Honor the red and white being the color of Indonesia's flag, at Gunung Padang was heavily protested by various members of the archaeological community. Facing criticisms, TTRM attempted to integrate members of the archaeological community into their research, going as far as tempering their claims about Gunung Padang. However, research stalled in 2014, coinciding with the start of Joko Widodo's presidency and the end of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono's term. End quote. Basically, the president who supported their work had a bit of a reputation for falling for tricks that would have put a spotlight on Indonesia. That's a bit endearing, in my opinion, but this does come up later, I promise. Page 7, quote, "Archaeology operates by creating relational categories with which objects are analyzed. These relational categories operate on different scales, from object typology on the basis of shared chemical composition to comparison of states across different world regions. These categories are created through rigorous research which builds on prior observation about the archaeological past. TTRM's relational categories, however, were constructed through the consumption of popular and nationalist myths about the past. Representations of Egyptian archaeology in the popular media conflate Egypt's history into an amorphous, imaginary past that epitomizes the colonial fetish for ancient civilizations which are instantly recognizable through their pyramids. End quote. Page 7 continued. The construction of Gunung Padang as a national myth thus relies on the authenticity of other myths. End quote. Then, page 9, quote, prior to 2011, researchers mainly focused on site description and sourcing the columnar joints that were used in the construction of the site. Excavation was limited to several units and was mainly aimed at understanding how columnar joints were arranged underneath the visible top layer. TTRM's research, however, was focused on seeking evidence for a pyramid structure underneath the site. As such, TTRM was much more focused on vertical excavations and employed a more destructive excavation method. The lack of rigorous methodology meant that any data gathered by TTRM is unlikely to be useful for future studies, and the portion of the site TTRM excavated no longer has archaeological meaning. End quote. This is because when you move something without documenting it in an archaeological site, it loses its context, and context is what allows the professional to interpret the finding. Think about where you might find a knife, for example. If it's surrounded by animal bones, a fire pit, and some pottery, you might assume the knife was used to clean game or cook that game. If you find it with amulets, a headdress, and near what looks like an altar, that knife changes its meaning, doesn't it? Page 9 continued. At the same time, however, TTRM's focus on establishing a calendar date introduced carbon dating, which was a novel approach at the site. Their carbon dating produced wildly ranging dates of between 3,000 years before present and 28,000 years before present. Following the publication of TTRM's dates, dating the site has become more of a focus for researchers, with other archaeologists submitting their own carbon dates, which challenged TTRM's own results. End quote. Finally, pages 9 through 10, quote, research at Gunung Padang has stalled since 2014, coinciding with the conclusion of Yudhoyono's second term in office. End quote. This looks a bit like an aha moment for the YouTuber, doesn't it? But let's read on. Quote, unlike Yudhoyono, the incoming president, Joko or Jokowi Widodo, defined his vision for Indonesia as a global leader in the maritime sector. In a speech to the East Asia Summit in 2014, Jokowi outlined the pillars of his policies to include revival of Indonesia's archipelagic identity. Citing Indonesia's past as a great thalassocratic and seafaring nation, Jokowi imagined a new definition for an Indonesian national identity based around the concept of maritimeness. Following Jokowi's election, both state and academic archaeologists shifted their attention to maritime archaeology, to be in line with the new national narrative of the past. TTRM's research program at Gunung Padang, based around a different nationalist ideology, is currently no longer salient to the national imagination of the past. The dissipating interest to the national narrative being constructed at Gunung Padang meant that research at the site will likely be discontinued. End quote. See? Completely benign. And you can read layers and layers of smoke and mirrors into this, as you can with anything. But this certainly does not sound like the dating of the site closed it down. In fact, it doesn't even sound like TTRM's allegedly shoddy mythology was the reason, but rather a focus on a different aspect of Indonesia's history and culture. The YouTuber also mentioned a similar occurrence in South America, but unfortunately that continent has more than one archaeological site. So while the YouTuber did in fact address the commenter's request for evidence of a government shutting down fieldwork, I can't really give them the point for this one. Let's finally move on to point number 4. The commenter said that if sites were shut down simply because they challenged the archaeological knowledge, people would speak out against it. The YouTuber doesn't address this, and I'm not sure I really agree, so I'm not giving anyone the point here. Number 5. Where is the evidence? The commenter asks. The YouTuber gives shoddy evidence, yet again, saying, quote, I was in Egypt where the government are ripping out the crystal that lines the pyramids and burying it out in the desert. Have literal video evidence of before and after. Also, a lot of my argument comes from science and geology. The mainstream timeline has serious holes and problems that can't be accounted for. Geology is telling a different story to the original narrative. And science is backing up more and more of the idea we are from a history of cycles, end quote. There's a lot going on there, so let's take it one line at a time. They were in Egypt, where they claim the government is stripping pyramids of their crystal cases and burying them in the desert. And the YouTuber has, quote, literal video evidence of before and after, end quote. Before and after a pyramid having a crystal casing and then not? This suggests they were a first-hand witness or primary resource. I watched the entirety of the video this comment exchange was on, and the only bit that could be mistaken for evidence, if you squint, is when their tour guide holds up alabaster and claims there were 50-ton piles of this alabaster all around the ruins at Saqqara, and now they're not. So, literal before and after video evidence of what, exactly? The tour guide telling you a story? They say next, a lot of my argument comes from science, and geology. They didn't say where, mentioned no studies. I did notice the head of the TTRM at Gunung Padang was a geologist, so maybe they're talking about him? Quote unquote, quote, the mainstream timeline has serious holes and problems that can't be accounted for. Geology is telling a different story to the original narrative, and science is backing up more and more the idea we are from a history of cycles. End quote. What holes? What problems that can't be accounted for? What does geology tell you that is different to the original narrative? And for that matter, what narrative? Do you realize that the narrative changes every day with each new study? It isn't some static thing. You can't even become a PhD without bringing something new to the subject. And finally, whose science is backing up a history of cycles? This particular line I found on a website about the chematology fellows Stephen Mailer and Abd el-Hakim Awiyan, who shares a last name with their tour guide, but I don't know if they're related as claimed or what. Hakim, as the website claims he liked to be called, believed in less of a linear history and more a history of cycles. I'm really confused about this idea because I can really argue that history is linear and that it's a series of cycles. These are abstract concepts that don't offer much to falsify or to verify. It's a weak claim that looks like the YouTuber used it in their response and is meant only to befuddle their commenter rather than provide any concrete information. I really appreciate this commenter's dedication and the way they articulated their criticism. They deserved a better response. When I tally up the score, the YouTuber addresses 3 points with unresearched evidence, quote-unquote evidence, a lie, and a series of statements to brush off the commenter. A member of the archaeological or historical community could never get away with that. So why should this person, or people like them? This is a final point that sort of illustrates how quickly and easily it is for somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about to stir up discontent and questions where there really don't need to be any questions. The YouTuber at one point in this video in question mentions how the site they're visiting had been closed for the last 20 years or so for restorations, but that the entire thing took the ancient Egyptians 20 years to build. They said the math doesn't add up, implying, I believe, that the ancient Egyptians' ability to build an entire structure in the time it takes us to restore it, even with modern technology and techniques, proves the ancient builders possessed some technology that is superior to ours even today. Let me just address that with a few suggestions. There were many people helping to build. There were likely very few people allowed inside to restore. Bureaucracy starts and stalls work of this kind all the time. It's frustrating, but part of the job. Before someone can restore a site, they first have to document its current state. The bigger the site, the more documentation. In ancient times, pyramid building was a thriving industry with loads of people to choose from. Archaeological site restoration is a very specific industry now, with a very limited number of people to choose from. Lastly, consider motivation. The supreme ruler, your god king, orders you to build a pyramid versus some dudes begging for grant money. These may not all be applicable to this particular site, but the YouTuber's argument here is a great representation of the level of thinking that goes into the alt history community's theories. They see the smallest coincidence and take it as cold, hard proof that their unresearched opinion is fact. They don't at all go into what was realized in the restoration, which includes, quote, rough, hand-chiseled tunnels were now supported with Gothic-looking stone arches. A few plexiglass panels installed in the new wooden walkway revealed the original tunnel floor. The well-lit, well-ventilated space feels more like a museum than a dark, sacred maze that was already thousands of years old during the lifetime of Herodotus. Nor do they discuss what planning had to occur, whether the contract was given to one group and then another, whether any political turmoil might have contributed to a stalling and then an extension of the work. Not a single mention of the other side's argument. Do you see why? Because their arguments are flimsy and therefore clearly not built by ancient Egyptians. Let's move into our charity of the day. After more than 6 years of conflict, Yemen remains the world's largest humanitarian crisis, and millions of displaced Yemenis are only a step away from famine. The risk of a large-scale famine in the country has never been more acute. Tens of thousands are already living in famine-like conditions, with a staggering 5 million more just one step away from it. Displaced families are 4 times more at risk of famine than the rest of the Yemeni population. Yemen is facing a humanitarian catastrophe. Without help, many more lives will be lost to violence, treatable illnesses, or lack of food, water, and shelter. If you have the means, I encourage you to donate. Even $1 is more than nothing, and if you can't afford that, sharing a link is a great help. Please see the top link in the description. So next time, part 5 is our conclusion, where we recap our journey, talk about what research and questions didn't make the cut, and provide a final comment on pseudo-archaeology. You'll also get a sneak peek at the next series on the Dawning podcast. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you next Friday.